Shock hit me like a fist, only softer, colder, the thing that bruises a person from the inside. It was 2 a.m. when Emily fell into my arms, her face a map of shame and fear, and for a moment all the years I had spent being polite and reasonable felt like a costume I could finally peel off. I made her tea, wrapped her in my old cardigan, and listened to the tremor in her voice as she said, "He hit me." I did not gasp. I did not scream. I began to take notes in my head. Who would she become if I shouted and the wrong people heard? How had the man she loved learned to hide behind charm and paperwork? Could truth be used like a quiet weapon, sharp, surgical, and precise? There are no grand confrontations in this story. There are receipts, small witnesses, a frightened accountant with a conscience, and a mother who remembers how to wait. There is a slow, steady unspooling that strips a predator of his alibis, not with spectacle but with quiet, relentless evidence. Hi, I'm Maggie Lewis, and this is my story. The knock at the back door was urgent enough to wake me, but not so loud it woke the house. When I opened it, my daughter folded into me like a paper doll, slender, shaking, and with a dark crescent beneath one eye. Her breath smelled of cigarettes and something else I couldn't name. I guided her inside, set a kettle on, and wrapped her in my cardigan because that's what mothers do before they ask questions, they make sure you don't freeze. "Mom," she whispered, clinging to me as if I held the center of her world. Daniel, he hit me." I felt something in me go very still. Not a scream, not a shout, stillness that felt like a plan beginning to take shape. I asked the quiet questions. Do you want to call someone? Do you want to go to the hospital? She shook her head. Not yet, she said. Please, not yet. I brewed tea and put a wet compress to the darkening bruise. While she shivered on my couch, I noticed small things, a smudge of dirt on the cuff of her coat, a car's headlights that slowed down the lane then sped away, the empty spot on her wrist where a bracelet might have been. She flinched at the sound of a passing car and buried her face in my shoulder. The fear in her was not new, it had a history. When she finally slept, it was with her face pressed to my old scarf. I sat at the kitchen table with the kettle's slow gurgle and made a list in my head, small, practical items: call the neighbor tomorrow, lock her spare keys, check bank notifications, ask no leading questions until I had something to act on. The night felt too sharp to cry, it felt like something that required steady hands. Outside, a late-slung cloud scraped the moon. Inside, I began to plan the first, quiet moves. Morning light softened the bruise but did nothing to soften Emily's voice when she finally spoke what I already suspected. She told me about a text, a name that came with a gif that had made Daniel laugh in a way she'd never seen before. She told me about a raised hand that wasn't meant to stay raised, a slammed door, footsteps in the hallway at 3 a.m. I listened without interruption. When you've been married to a man who can charm a room, you learn how to let him reveal himself by what he tries hardest to hide. Don't tell anyone, Emily pleaded. The plea was 2 parts fear and 1 part shame. She was terrified of the pity in other people's eyes. He'll ruin everything. He'll say I made it up. He'll make me sign something, Anne. She stopped, fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. I watched the way she avoided my eyes when she said sign something. That small avoidance said more than any admission. I wrapped my hands around hers and said, we don't have to do anything you don't want. But we do have to keep you safe. She told me about the late-night phone calls that turned into arguments, about hush-money laughs in public, about Daniel's ability to be 2 people, the man at charity dinners and the man with a tight jaw behind closed doors. The conversation was a folding out of small, ordinary cruelties that, strung together, made something ugly and unstoppable. When she asked me again to keep it quiet, I agreed for the moment, but inside I was placing pins on a map I couldn't yet show her. Sometimes the best protection is silence until you can turn it into proof. I promised Emily I would watch, listen, and gather, not for drama, but for the day truth could be carried like an immovable thing into a courtroom or a bank or a ledger. That night, before she slept, she whispered, I'm sorry. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She slept with my hand over her heart, I slept with a notebook under my pillow. A mother who's learned to look notices the ordinary anomalies. I began to see them in Emily's life: bank notifications that arrived at odd hours, a spare set of keys Daniel insisted she keep hidden, an email subject line that didn't match the sender. Emily would glance at her phone and then tuck it away too fast. She flinched when mine buzzed. She watched the window more often than seemed natural. I walked past her kitchen and found a receipt tucked under the fruit bowl: a taxi at midnight, paid in cash. On another shelf, a lipstick cap not belonging to Emily's usually careful collection. When I asked, she blamed the neighbor's party. When I pressed, she shrugged and said she must have been distracted. The evasions fitted together like a loose puzzle. Our neighbor, Mrs. Dwyer, came by with lemon cake and an apology for the late-night noise. She mentioned in passing, small, offhand, that she'd seen Daniel's car a few doors down, twice, late in the evenings. He seemed to be visiting someone else, she said, blinking like she wasn't offering a terrible betrayal. Mrs. Dwyer's eyes were kind and quick. She'd been the sort who notices footsteps and remembers the color of shoes. Her remark stuck to me. Emily's phone sometimes lit up with bank notifications, and she would tuck it face down. One evening, while she was distracted, I saw a string of numbers on the screen that looked like a transfer confirmation. My stomach went cold: transfers to accounts I did not recognize. Emily caught me looking and forced a laugh. It's business stuff. But the laugh had a hollow sound. I began to take more careful note: dates, times, small details that could later be stitched into something larger. The pattern was not yet clear, but it smelled of intentionality, like a thread someone had sewn to collapse under a certain pressure. I scribbled names and numbers on a napkin and folded it into my pocket. Quiet observation, I reminded myself, was the patient friend of justice. When Emily finally told me about the business, she did so with her voice half buried in the crook of my arm. Daniel had been pushing her to sign documents. He told them they were for a partnership, for growth, phrases that sound safe until you realize you didn't write them. She felt small when she said it, embarrassed that her signature could be used as a weapon against her. I asked for the paperwork under the guise of organizing things. She hesitated, then handed me a folder heavy with envelopes and a ring of contracts that smelled faintly of smoke and cologne. As I turned the pages, details prickled at the back of my neck: guarantor forms in her name, loan agreements she swore she hadn't read, and a bank authorization slip with odd routing numbers. "Did you sign all these?" I asked softly. She nodded, eyes distant. "He said I had to. He said he'd take care of everything." There was a trembling to the way she said "take care," as though the phrase had been used to justify 1,000 small erasures. The financial papers looked like dry bones until you held them up to the light, then you could see where deception had been stitched in. I logged into the bank app with her permission and traced flows, small at first, then larger, moving through accounts that were not listed on any joint statements. There were withdrawals timed to coincide with dinner dates, transfers to names I'd never heard. A pattern emerged: funds moving out, then being laundered through shell accounts, always leaving Emily's name as guarantor. This was not a simple marital spreadsheet. This was a shadow ledger that could make her culpable. My chest tightened, not from panic but from a cold, practical rage. Whoever had the pen could make the paper say nearly anything. Whoever planned it had thought far enough ahead to make the truth look like fiction the moment anyone asked questions. I folded the documents back into the folder and slid them into a kitchen drawer. "We'll get help," I said. That night I sat at my kitchen table with a lamp and a magnifying glass I hadn't used since my father kept stamp collections. The signatures were close but not quite right: a hesitation in the loop of an E, a pressure point that didn't match Emily's light hand. Dates had been shifted by a day in a few places. An email purporting to be from Emily to a lender used phrases she never used. I could hear her voice in my head when she read aloud, "We're so excited to expand," and it felt like someone else's mouth. I made copies, digital and paper. I photographed the loan agreements, saved PDFs, and labeled everything carefully. Documentation is a small, greedy god. It will accept any time, any detail you can feed it. I composed a timeline from the receipts and the bank alerts I'd seen: taxi rides, dinners, late withdrawals, and a specific transfer that had moved through 3 accounts in a 48-hour span. A suspicious email chain suggested a shell company, another document referenced a consulting firm with an address that, when I searched it quietly, belonged to an empty unit in a business complex. The deeper I dug, the less accidental everything appeared. There was method, and method is evidence's first friend. When Emily woke and saw me with the spread of papers, she almost recoiled. "You shouldn't do that," she said, frantic. "He'll know." I could see the logic. An exposed mother might burn bridges faster than a silent one. But silence is only helpful when it protects the vulnerable, it betrays when it protects the guilty. I called an old friend, the sort who knows how to read numbers as stories. He agreed to meet and look at the documents with the discretion of someone who'd guarded secrets for a living. "We'll need more than a feeling," he said. "We'll need to show a pattern." I had already started one, page by page, signature by signature. That night I slipped the copies into a folder labeled personal and tucked it into the hollow of my closet. It was the kind of thing you carry until you are ready to use it. Quiet preparation is an act of love that often looks like patience from the outside. Daniel arrived with a smile that was designed to disarm and a bouquet of flowers that smelled faintly of the perfume he always wore when he wanted to be forgiven in public. He wore a cardigan and the sort of polite worry that men with good lawyers cultivate. He asked after Emily with a softness that had fooled plenty of people in the past. He stepped over my threshold like he owned the place, and for a moment that small movement felt like a test. I kept my voice steady and my hands visible. I offered him tea, he accepted with a practiced gratitude. In the living room, he asked Emily how she was, and she answered in clipped sentences. He moved close enough at one point that she flinched. That flinch told me everything more than any confession could. When I excused myself to the kitchen, I left them with a half-empty cup. The muffled words through the thin wall stopped being small after he leaned in. I heard the low threat he used, soft, intimate, the kind that sounds like love but has teeth. "You know the rules," he said, and I could hear the grin in his voice. Emily's reply was nearly a whisper. I returned with a tray as if nothing had happened. Daniel reached for Emily's hand but she pulled away, and he masked it with humor. He asked about our weekend plans and whether Emily had thought about the gala next month. His questions were syrupy, meant to smooth the skin of suspicion. After he left, smiling, waving, promising to pick up a bottle of wine on his way, the house felt colder. I found a lipstick stain on a stem of his jacket and a small scuff by the back door that smelled faintly of someone trying to leave in a hurry. I made a note to follow the receipts from the florist and to check the camera footage that our neighbor kept for her porch light. "He's good at being seen as good," I told Emily later. She nodded as if that explained everything. "He's practiced," I added. "And practiced people get sloppy when they think you won't look closely." The sloppiness was where truth hid. I told myself then that I would not let it stay hidden. The call came through a blocked number at noon, a voice I didn't recognize at first, then, after a pause, someone who introduced himself as Thomas, the accountant. He spoke fast, like someone who had rehearsed a confession. "I can't keep this to myself," he said. "I've been trying to square the books and I keep finding transfers that don't make sense. Names, accounts, some of them linked to your daughter." He asked to meet in a cafe where no one would notice a man with a briefcase. He looked worn, guilty in the way people look when they've lived too long with a lie. He confirmed suspicions as if ticking boxes. Daniel had been moving money through shell accounts, sometimes under Emily's name, sometimes under newly created entities whose paperwork was filed with sloppy care. "He's not just spending money," Thomas said. "He's creating stories for money to travel through." He told me about ledgers that showed small, repeated transfers, enough to be plausible as business expenses, not so much to trigger audit alarms. There were also bigger sums that moved in 2-day cycles, appearing and disappearing like tide marks. When I asked why he'd reached out, he said, "Because something doesn't feel right. And because I'm tired of being complicit." Having someone from the inside was an unexpected relief. He explained how to preserve evidence without alerting Daniel: "Make copies, don't confront, and get the records to someone who could protect them. He warned that Daniel was meticulous in person but careless in his digital traces. When he left, he dropped a folder on the table and asked me to be careful. I opened it at home and found spreadsheets, screenshots of transfers, and a list of account names that matched those in my folder. He had labeled entries with dates and amounts tied to events, dinners, hotel stays, sums that now fit the picture of a man who had used charm as cover. That night I locked the folder in my safe. There's a strange comfort in knowing things you can act upon. The allies' arrival had changed the scale of the problem from private grief to something that could be proven. Confrontation is a funny thing, it either breaks you or makes you steady. When I gently showed Emily the ledger Thomas had left, her shoulders folded like a map creased too many times. She had been carrying fear like an extra sweater, and the weight of numbers finally made her cry. It started as petty things, she admitted between sobs. He'd ask for signatures for small invoices, just administrative. Then the amounts grew. He told me I'd be protecting our home. He said I owed him for everything he'd done for the business. I signed because I thought that's what you do when someone tells you they're saving you. Her eyes were raw and honest, shame and relief braided together. She told me how Daniel used to corner her when she asked questions, how he'd smile and tell her she was overreacting. He said I was dramatic, she whispered. He'd say, if you make a scene, I'll make it worse for you. The threats were quiet, persistent, like a drip wearing away at her confidence. We talked for hours, about how love can look like control, how small intimations of guilt can make someone feel indebted. Emily's voice would break, then gather, then break again. She confessed to signing things under pressure, to ignoring nagging doubts because he would soothe them with a weekend away or a compliment that landed like a bandage. When she spoke of being coerced into signing loan guarantees, her hands trembled. I held them and told her she had not been clever, but she had been a victim of a carefully practiced cruelty. They make the cage invisible until you're already trapped, I said. She squeezed my hand, and for the first time in months her breath evened. We planned the next steps, keep all documents together, avoid confrontation until we had counsel, and expand our little circle of trust. She asked if I would go with her to the bank to ask questions. I said yes. She asked if I would stay when she met the lawyer. I said yes. There was a small gratitude in her smile that felt like a promise, that soon, perhaps, the weight would lift. What we found that rainy afternoon in the accountant's saved files felt like the moment a curtain falls and reveals the shadow play behind it. Hidden in an encrypted folder labeled with a bland business name was a spreadsheet titled Exit Plan. The file showed dates for transfers, tickets purchased in cash, and notes about timing. There was even a scanned receipt for a one-way ticket to a country with lax extradition laws, purchased just days from now. It became painfully clear that Daniel had not only been siphoning money but was constructing a legal pathway to leave, leaving Emily's name smeared across documents that would make her look complicit. The more we dug, the more cold the pattern: create debt under her name, manufacture paper trails, set a timetable to depart when scrutiny would point to Emily as the responsible party. I felt a kind of fury then that wasn't loud. It was the focused anger of a woman who knows how to use the law as a tool. The plan was not to hurt him with spectacle but to cut off his escape routes with facts. He thinks we will panic, Thomas the accountant said. He plans for that. He doesn't plan for someone who will sit very still until their case is assembled. We moved quickly but carefully. I made copies of the exit plan file in 3 formats and sent them, encrypted, to the lawyer's secure address. We set up a meeting with an investigator. Emily, who had been swollen with shame, now sat straighter. The knowledge that there was a date, 3 days away, did something to the air around her. Fear shifted into actionable purpose. We created timelines, matched receipts to transfers, and prepared to present the pattern to authorities in a way that couldn't be dismissed as a marital spat. The plan I had been building in my head since that first night now had legs, evidence, allies, legal counsel, and a clock that would not be manipulated by charm. Standing in our small kitchen with papers spread like a map of betrayal, I realized revenge would not be a roar. It would be a procedure, calculated, inevitable, and hushed until the moment the cuffs closed. The best plans begin in small rooms. In the lawyer's office, we spoke in low tones. She was a woman who had the look of someone who had read too many depositions and lived to tell the story. "We don't arrest based on feelings," she said. "We arrest based on facts." She walked us through the steps: freeze certain accounts, file a report, secure affidavits, and keep Emily's presence minimal in places Daniel could easily access. We created redundancies. Copies of the ledger went to a secure cloud with two-factor authentication. Paper trails were duplicated and given to trusted friends, including Mrs. Dwyer, and the investigator began quietly subpoenaing records. Thomas arranged to be available for testimony and prepared a notarized statement. The lawyer recommended we do everything slowly and correctly so Daniel's defense would have nothing to exploit. Emily's fear was still palpable, but a new thing slid in beside it: resolve. She began to be careful in her movement, to change small habits that might be used against her. We set up a safety plan for her: routes to leave if needed, a packed bag with documents, and a small amount of cash hidden in a place she alone knew. We practiced short scripts for encounters: what to say if questioned at work, how to avoid being baited into signing anything. The lawyer warned that the kind of man who'd write an exit plan would be likely to try to manipulate witnesses, so we made a list of people he might try to sway and began discreetly preparing them. Night after night I watched Emily sleep a fraction more peacefully. The quiet plan, bank freezes, legal filings, witness statements, moved like a machine oiled by patience. It was not glamorous. It was not righteous spectacle. It was the slow work of making a set of facts so clean and lined that there would be nowhere left for Daniel to hide. As the legal wheels began to turn, Daniel grew restless. He called at odd hours, his voice oscillating between placation and fury. He showed up at the gallery where Emily hung her photos, insisting on walking her home. He stopped by our house casually under the pretense of returning a book. Each time, his presence left a trace like a handprint on glass, unsettling and obvious to those who knew to look. On the day we filed the first formal complaints, the investigator called to say they had pulled records that matched the patterns we'd compiled. Emily was advised not to engage, and I stood with her in a parking garage and watched her get into a car driven by a friend. She looked younger somehow, as if the act of being believed had lightened her. That night Daniel banged on our door, voice loud, accusing us of conspiracy. I kept calm, spoke in measured sentences, and let the friend who drove Emily call the police to report harassment. He left in a huff, and I could see he was unnerved in a way he hadn't been before. Small victories stacked: a bank placed a temporary hold on a suspicious transfer, a witness agreed to make a statement about the mistress's visits, the accountant provided signed, dated copies of questionable entries. Daniel, sensing a tightening, began making mistakes: emails sent from personal addresses, receipts left unshredded, that fed into our growing pile of proof. We watched the clock. He had planned on 3 days to leave. We had shortened that timeline by moving faster than he anticipated. When the investigator told us they were ready to question him, I felt the strange, quiet triumph that comes from a plan executed without theatricality. Justice, in this context, moved with the pace of paperwork and persistence. The day the investigator came to Daniel's office was bright and ordinary, which made the scene feel even more final. He tried, at first, to laugh it off. "There's been a misunderstanding," he told his colleagues. But the records Thomas had produced, the emails we'd uncovered, and the timeline we'd assembled left little room for smiling ambiguity. When officers escorted him to a side room for questioning, the expression on his face was no longer charming. It was wary, like a man who'd had the map of his life redrawn without his consent. The mistress's statement, previously a rumor, lined up with hotel logs and receipts. The bank's temporary hold flagged the transfers Nancy, the investigator, had been tracking. Piece by piece, the structure he had built collapsed. Emily, notified of the questioning, sat in our kitchen with her hands wrapped around hot tea. She looked smaller and steadier at once. The relief was not theatrical, it was a breath that found its way out after a long, held tension. She could breathe without bracing for the next blow. "What happens now?" she asked, eyes on the rim of her cup. The investigator explained that charges would be considered, that there would be hearings, and that the process could be slow. I promised simply to be there every step. We celebrated with lemon cake, the sort Mrs. Dwyer used to bring, and we did not gloat. A mother's victory is not about triumph over another, it's about reclaiming the life of her child. That evening, Daniel called from an unknown number, trying guilt and pleading. Emily let it ring out. The consequences were not quick, but they were coming, and they came with the cautious dignity of law rather than the spectacle of revenge. What followed was an unraveling that was quieter than the tabloids might like but harder to deny. Daniel's accounts were frozen, subpoenas drew forth more paperwork, and his accountant, who had once been small tremor of conscience, provided an affidavit that tied the transfers to dates we had already circled. He testified about being asked to obscure entries, about being threatened, and about the weight of the truth he could no longer hide. The mistress, who had been a rumor, testified about the pattern of visits and the conversations that hinted at an exit plan. Her words were not theatrical, they were detailed and precise, and they fit the ledger like a missing tile. Daniel's comfortable circles began to pull away. People who had smiled at his wit found themselves frowning at his evasions. There was a moment I remember with odd clarity, a call from the investigator telling us they had enough to proceed with charges. Emily sat in her favorite chair and folded her hands. "I thought I'd be ashamed forever," she said. "But now I see how careful he was, how scared he was of being small." She laughed a small, stunned laugh. The fall, as it happened, was not a hurricane but a long, inevitable sinking as evidence accumulated and as alibis frayed. When he called from custody, his voice a thin thing, asking her to fix this, she hung up as if closing a curtain. That click was not cruelty, it was the sound of a woman reclaiming her days. Weeks after the first knock at my door, the house smelled of chamomile and rain. Emily and I sat on my porch with 2 steaming mugs, watching the tide of evening traffic, listening to the small orchestra of neighbors watering their gardens. She had lost weight but gained something steadier, a horizon. The official letters arrived, some clearing her name, others detailing restitution and court dates. The legal process was not neat, and it left scars. Daniel would face hearings, his plans to flee had been stopped. He would not be the man he thought he could be. The law, slow but persistent, had done what a shouted accusation could not, it had dismantled a carefully contrived escape route. Emily was not the same wide-eyed girl who'd fallen into my arms at 2 a.m., but she was lighter. She had begun therapy, taken back small pleasures, and started photographing again, her hand steady enough to hold light. We planted lavender by the back steps because she liked the smell and because small rituals are the bones of recovery. One afternoon, a letter arrived from someone who had been on the periphery, a cousin who had once whispered that Emily was overreacting. The cousin wrote a simple apology and a pledge of support. The tiny courtesies of amends, people watching for the person you saved, felt like balm. I never stood on a hill and announced my victory. There was no speech, no public shaming, only the quiet paperwork, the careful testimonies, and the presence of those who would not be bought. The revenge was not to humiliate but to protect, to make sure a woman could live her life without someone else writing her story in someone else's handwriting. That evening, as the sun slid down behind the maple, Emily rested her head on my shoulder and said, "Thank you." I put my hand on hers and felt, finally, the lightness that comes after a long vigil. We watched the light fade and, somewhere between dusk and dinner, I said softly, "You're free now."